So, Lewis, thank you so much for coming. It's such a big pleasure to speak with you today. As you know, I've just told you I had messed up the time difference, and I've sat here for an hour with excited anticipation. But the time is now. I'm so grateful that the interview is here. For those who are less familiar with your work, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, first, it's such a delight to get to spend this time with you. And additionally, what I would like to say to a lot of people out there is I hope you're doing well. I could begin by saying Hotep, I could say Shalom. I could also, there are many ways in which we could say hello. But one of the things that we see right away when we say hello, it's very strange that there's so many languages that say hello to it for words that ultimately come down to peace. So that already tells you something very strange about the world, because if you're a Zulu, you would say Sawubona. And Sawubona means I see you. So already think about it, right? There are people who have to say they come in peace because a fellow human being is like a threat. Whereas there are societies where a fellow human being is like, wow, I see you, you're there, welcome. Okay, so I'll say Sawabona, but there are many languages. I could say Vanakkam because I'm also part Tamil, which is what's said in India. But you asked me more about who in the world is this dude? Well, well, um, look, I am the straightforward professional stuff is I'm head and professor of philosophy department at University of Connecticut, and I'm the honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies. And I am an honorary professor in the unit for the humanities at Rhodes University, where I used to be the Mandela professor. And I am a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg and a bunch of other stuff. That's the professional stuff. But the intellectual part is a more complicated story. What many people have described me as, particularly in some of the French magazines or some of the websites or stuff like Global Forum Theory, is as the I hate the terms founder because there's something weird about this. I don't. I think people at least cultivate or have a relationship with things. Okay, so I would say that I'm one of the people who played an important role in the development, the articulation, and the global development of Africana, African diasporic is another way of saying it, phenomenology and existentialism, Black existentialism. I played a very important role also in developing a whole area of thought in the study of what's called disciplinary decadence. And I do a lot of work in liberation thought. There are people in what's today called decolonial thought, and I've been the person who have brought out concerns about how the global South, Black thought, and varieties of other thought from Asia and other places are configured in decolonial thought. But beyond all that, if one were to list my specializations, a lot of my work is about the human being's relationship to reality and the many unfortunate ways we attempt to avoid it. So I've written a lot on bad faith, which is our ability to lie to ourselves. And that led me to doing a lot of work in the human sciences. So in terms of specializations, my specializations are in existentialism or philosophy of existence, social and political philosophy, phenomenology, philosophy of education, philosophy of science, because I do work in multidimensional theory and physics. I also do work in the complexity of how sciences relate to each other. And the work I do in social and political philosophy is rather radical. And what I mean by that is I don't do the narrow applications of what is justice, what is sovereignty, what is that sort of stuff. I deal with the radical questions of what are the very conditions of how we even deal with normative life and the organization of power. So And beyond that, I do a lot of work in aesthetics and philosophy of music. Because I'm also known as a jazz musician, but I play in a variety of genres from rock and roll to hip hop to you name it. And so if you bring all of those things together and all those specializations, because as we know, when we think about our relationship to reality, it's not just about pointing at reality, it's also about living it. And if we simply live in terms of a small set of material things and a few elements of security, good God, we'd live such a boring life. So one of the reasons I look into aesthetics, music, etc., it's because I argue that what makes life livable should not be underestimated. You can give a human being a lot of things, but if you don't give a human being livable life, she or he or they might just go walk off of a cliff. So anyway, that's a short well, that's not that short, but that's some of what I'm about. But related to that, I also I'm a person who built a lot of institutions. So there's the Journal Radical Philosophy Review, the Phenomenology Roundtable, was the first president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, varieties of book series, things like those. And beyond that, I also created schools. Particularly, I try to build things for people whom most people try to avoid. So in the 80s, I built a school for young people nobody wanted to teach. And we're fortunate, it was a very successful program. And I tend to work with communities that, as I said, that often are either overlooked, suppressed, etc. So a lot of my work connects me not only with indigenous peoples of South America, but in India, Dalits, across Southern Africa, what people would say the Bantu speaking peoples, but just generally speaking, people who are getting the short stick of Euro modernity. And this also includes Eastern Europeans. So there's a lot we could talk about, but I think that could give the viewers a sense of what I do.
Hmm. And of these specialities, what makes them so special to you?
They are special to me, connected to two things that I was that I three things from my childhood. The first thing from my childhood is very positive. I was born in the island of Jamaica, and this was in the 1960s, and this is before there was a lot of light pollution there. So you could lie on your back in the night on the grass and look up at the stars. And as a child, I just thought how wondrous that was, just how vast and beautiful. The universe, now multiverse, right, is. And but I was born the year Jamaica became an independent country, 1962. I was born a few months before that. And I began to speak very early in my childhood. Uh, the thing about when you start speaking early is your memories are early. So in my case, I began to speak at 3 months. And what that meant was I have memories of what my grandmother's aunts and all these people were saying. And so this wonder of the stars while witnessing the transition from colonialism, that was something that had an indelible mark on me. Additionally, in my childhood, I learned very early there are two things I absolutely despise. I despise bullies and I despise cruelty. For me, colonialism is basically an historical rallying of resources for the welfare of bullies, which is why I've been a staunch anti-colonialist and a staunch liberationist. But even if you didn't have bullies, cruelty is very complicated because there are ways in which people can be self-righteous and moralistic. They may say they're doing what's good for you, but ultimately they can be cruel. And cruelty degrades the spirit. Cruelty attacks dignity, attacks freedom. So very early on, the thing that animated me, right, was one, through looking up at the stars, a realization that reality is much bigger than us. So that brings in an ethic of humility. But two, it really is extraordinary that if you're in a plane looking down at the earth, you don't see anybody. You just see land, if once the clouds are out of the way. But what you know is there are billions of people down there. How in the world that, from the perspective of the skies, what could be like dust mites, little dots, little specks moving around, can have such valuable lives? You see? From the point of view of the universe, our little blue dot, our little planet, is just a speck of dust in a cloud of dust, just swirling out there. But it's our speck of dust. And in our speck of dust, it is momentous. There are animals, plants, all the way from the blue whale to viruses, which is on everybody's mind during the pandemic. It's all here. And sometimes when I teach my students, in my classes, I ask them to imagine the point of view of a dot. Because, we don't think about it. But if a dot has a point of view, you know what the dot sees itself as? Would be the way we see ourselves, as fully embodied, as a whole perspective on the world. So at that moment, we realize a profound level of value, you see? And those elements come together. They've affected me throughout. But also, they have affected me in terms of some people I admired as a child. And among them was a tiny lady who's now passed away. Wow, I can't believe 17 years, but that was my mother. My mother was a tiny, courageous woman. My mother was, or in today's language, badass. She will stand up to anything, anyone. I mean, and and it would really move me realizing what was the source of her courage and her strength. Because, today people tend to think of strength and courage in very macho, you know, power, force stuff. The source of her strength and her power was love. It's extraordinary when people develop their courage out of love, because it means it's not really about themselves. They're thinking about others. If it's about themselves, they're like, why bother? You know what I mean? But when they know it's about how others are affected, they get up and act. And that, I have to say, I admire, and I still do admire my mother. I've seen her face things you wouldn't believe, and it was striking when she died. Without even advertising, it just went around. She helped so many people that, and without even advertising, there were more than 1,800 people just showed up at her funeral to, with everyone with a story of how that woman helped them. So, when you witness and you grow up with a person like that, and there are others like her. I've heard others in the Caribbean and other parts of Africa tell stories of women like that. There are men like that too, but we know that the societies are structured in such a way to make it really difficult for a courageous woman to get through a day. You know what I mean? And so the fact that these are women I'm talking about really, really brings a lot home. And we know that racism affects it with, say, Black men and so forth. But my mother was a Black Jewish woman. And you have to imagine all those elements converging on an island like Jamaica. And then when she migrated to the United States, you know, and, you know, and just one thing, I know I'm speaking for a while here, but one thing connected to her that sticks with me. There are many things. I mean, I have many stories about my mother, but we were, when we came to the United States, undocumented. And, you know, the world right now is full of cruelty against undocumented people, refugees, etc. And for a brief period during the Reagan administration, there was a reprieve where if you're undocumented, you could show up and become legal within a day. Well, my mother and I went in New York City, showed up, but it turned out they were only processing 75 people a day. And there were thousands of people who showed up. And it was winter. And what were we to do? So we stood there. We just stood there in the cold. And you have to remember, we're from a tropical island, so it was cold. And people began to fall, and people began to leave. And we just kept moving up the line. And my mother and I just stood out in that cold throughout the night, freezing, leaning on each other. She would take a nap, leaning on me. I'd take a nap, leaning on her. But eventually the door opened and we were number 59. And by the end of the day, we were legal. And a lot of people don't, if someone were to ask me prior to that experience, could you do that? I would have said, hell no. No, I would have frostbite. Somehow we developed the resources in ourselves to do that. I think it was the first time I truly meditated, you know, because I had to learn how to not pay attention to the pain of being frozen out there. And that little woman was there doing the same.
It's a really, really powerful story that just iterates the importance of surrounding ourselves with people that invite those resources to grow within us as well. We may not all have had the same, fortune to be born into a family with a mother like yours who represents what she does for you, but that's not to say that we can't take inspiration and power from your story there, from that message there of just how powerful and impactful others in the world can be.
Indeed. You know, it's funny, I didn't mention my father, but my father, my paternal grandmother was Chinese. And my father, um, she basically, to make a long story short, this was during a period of anti-miscegenation with the British Empire and stuff in Jamaica. And, you know, she had children with a Black man and they were ostracized. And eventually she became a concubine to a Chinese man. And her children the Chinese community wouldn't accept the children. And so my father and his brothers were homeless in the streets at the age of 5. And they were, you know, my father is very funny because he wasn't the eldest, but he was an extraordinary man. And it's funny, he grew up on the streets and he became known as Prince. He was a very good looking man, and you know, all the girls loved him and all that stuff. But it's striking again what his stories, what his experiences were. And he too, I mean, you know, lived through a lot of brutality, but he was only 5'8" and 125 pounds, but he was extraordinary courageous man. So you could imagine somebody like that meeting, my parents had me as adolescents. They were 19, meeting a woman like my mother and Somehow, I pop up in knowing those two people. I mean, I have to say, they're really extraordinary people. But we're here to talk about existentialism. So I realize perhaps we could move to that.
Indeed, indeed. So, I mean, from being born into this family to where you are now, what was that journey? What kind of led you towards the existential world?
Well, you know, there's an adage, all right, which is that you discover the road you're walking on turn out to be, and it's very psychoanalytical, right? Is the one that you were determining along the way. It's like the story of Kafka's Gate. The guy shows up and to the gate to the town and says, "Let me in." The gatekeeper says no. The guy keeps asking to be let in, and the gatekeepers keep saying no. And finally, the guy asks, "Whose gate is it?" And the gatekeeper yells down at him, "Yours." you know. And it's an interesting allegory about life, you see, because there are times we go through life and we're wondering, whose life are we living? And at some point, we have to remember we're living ours. Well, first, let me just say that there are a lot of ways people talk about existentialism, and there's a difference between existentialism and philosophy of existence. Okay, and although people have been engaged in philosophy of existence all the way from antiquity, when I teach my courses, I actually teach all the way from ancient East Africa. So we would read literature reflecting on existence that go back 4,000 years. So, okay. But the term existentialism was coined by Gabriel Marcel in the 1940s in his review of writings by Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. And at first, a lot of them rejected that idea because it has the ism in it, you see? And when you have the ism, it almost like it has a credo before you follow it. And that sneaks in a kind of essentialism that existentialists abhor. So if we start first with why they abhor it, a good idea, there are many languages, there are many ways to talk about it, about what we call existence. But since we're speaking in the English language, I will use that etymology because I talk about it in Meduneter, I talk about Hebrew, I talk about it in different languages, right? But in English, it comes from the Latin, okay? And the Latin has ex and sistera. And that, in the infinitive, sistera, that verb means to stand, right? Ex means out. So to stand out. So to emerge, that's pretty much what existence means. Now, to understand that, one should bear in mind that many people confuse existence with being, with what things are. Okay? But the thing is, if things simply are, if they never realize themselves, if they never think about themselves, then they'll never stand out. They just are. But the moment you stand out, you're other than being, you see? So the first confusion is many people think existentialism is about what's called ontology, the study of being. They think it's about being. And sometimes in English we use it that way, does this cup exist, But what we're really saying is does this cup have being, here. But the thing about when you stand out is not only do you appear, but other things appear. So at the heart of knowledge is existence as well. If nothing could stand out, if I could not see this cup as other than me, you see what I'm saying? I'll just blend into everything. But of course, if you stand out, you have the quintessential experience of what existence is about. Because you see, if you stand out, the question that comes to you is, are you responsible for the ways in which you stand out? You see, even though you may not have chosen, say, to be born, when you realize you're here, you now face the responsibilities of your action. I think one of the best existential stories in that regard is the story of Adam and Eve, because a lot of people miss the story. The Christian ways of reading it is, there's this serpent and Eve is seduced and eats the fruit and seduces Adam and the fall and but there's another version in many Jewish readings, but also existential readings, which is, if you posit the idea of God creating and all of that stuff, at the moment, all Adam and Eve would just be animals among other animals. However, I'll just say God for that. Why would God say, you can take whatever you want, just don't eat from this tree? Don't eat this fruit. Now, you already know, if you have children or if you remember being a kid, if your parents say to you, don't eat from this cookie jar, don't eat the cookies in this jar, when your parents come back, there are going to be some missing cookies. And but the point is, the moment Eve and Adam are told not to do this, they experience something. And what they experience is that the only thing that could stop them from eating that fruit is they themselves. And at that moment, they realize they have this extraordinary power. Think about it. If God is supposed to be omnipotent, omniscient, and all of this, God is the Big Mac Daddy, biggest powerful thing in the whole reality. Yet you can defy God. You, a tiny speck of a human being, have this enormous ability to disobey God. That is a moment of anguish and realization of freedom. And it's there whether they obeyed. Even if they hadn't eaten the fruit, they would have been changed, because at that moment, their humanity was born. They stood out as human beings. And so the thing about that is some of the stories I just told you in the beginning. You see, in my case, before I even thought of myself in those terms, yeah, I grew up in New York. I played jazz. Jazz is an extraordinarily existential music. I got to play with old jazz musicians in New York City, people like Roy Eldridge and Eddie Locke, and got to hang out with Frank Foster and Billy Taylor. Sometimes Dizzy Gillespie would come by, and if they do this, you can't say, well, I'm a kid. You got to play. And it's no accident some of the greatest jazz musicians, some of the greatest recordings were by people who were 15, 16, 17 years old, But the thing about it is, also growing up in New York is a very racist city. And I grew up with not only, I remember one day coming out of middle school where there were about a few thousand white people in blocks with weapons and so forth, because we were being bused into that school. Even little old grandma had her brass knuckles, So that's witnessing that level of cruelty, racial hatred, things like that, or just other things. As I see through it, I began to think there's got to be something we could do when we approach these. But more germane to your question, in terms of what led to me being a professional philosopher, theorist, and by the way, I don't always call myself a philosopher. Most existentialists don't. And it's because we question philosophy. But so it took years before I would even add the word philosophy. I would say as a radical theorist, right? But here's the thing. Remember I said I created a school in the 80s? Well, when that school was created, I was informed that by the people who helped support creating it, that the students I was working with would be so difficult that if we had a 10% success rate, 10% of them achieving a secondary school diploma, it would be a success. But we had 85%. And of course, that's so way above the expectation that I was asked to write a report on why it worked. And when I wrote the report, all the techniques, the data, blah, blah, something struck me that there was something that wasn't easy to articulate in that report. You see, my students were, and there were 75 of them, they were people whose lives were absolutely horrible. And there were certain things I did, like even though we had social workers and psychologists, I made a certain decision that I was not going to read any of their files. When I met those students, it's only what they want me to know about them is how we would relate. And there were lots of other things I did in that program. But at the end of the day, because it'll take too long to explain the program, the thing that I'm leading up to was why the program was successful is because when those young people walked into the rooms that we had organized for that program, they walked in as human beings. Their humanity was respected. Nothing, not a single thing we ever did in that program was done without expecting them to ask why. Their agency was respected. And it struck me, why is it, if I were to have asked all of those people, those young people before they came in that program, are you a human being? They would have all said yes. So if you know you're a human being, why does it matter if you're acknowledged or treated as a human being? Yet what we all know, if you treat people as human beings with respect, dignity, etc., they grow. And if you deny them that, if you disrespect them, if you treat them like crap, what happens? People wither. So I was concerned about the question of human potential. And I had this background in philosophy, classics, politics, etc. I could read ancient Greek and all of this stuff. And so I thought I would look in Aristotle because he wrote on potentiality. But my first semester of graduate school, I ended up taking a course from Maurice Nathanson. It was on Jean-Paul Sartre. And the course was on being and nothingness. And the way freedom was being talked about struck me. And I fell in love. It was clear to me that what I was talking about, what I was trying to do, was connected to the question of freedom and existence. And so I continued from there. And I ended up writing my dissertation on la mauvaise foi, bad faith. And my first book was Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, based on the dissertation. And I should say, at the time, I didn't know I was going to write as much as I've written. There are some, there are two scholars, Rosina Mart in South Africa and Soyan Day in India and Bhutan. They're doing an anthology, a reader of my work. And the press said they were permitted only 450,000 words. And it created a dilemma for them because they discovered I've written over 3 million words published. And here's the thing, it's very existential here, because you see, in philosophy of existence, you don't know in advance what you can do. You learn it through doing it. And to give you an even a better sense of this, when I started my now professional career, the racism I experienced in the academy was so severe that I expected, one, not really successfully to become a professor. That wasn't my goal, actually. I wanted the ideas, and I knew I loved writing. Two, I figured that the racism is so severe that 98% of what I write is going to be rejected anyway. And so I'd be lucky if 2% were published. So ironically, the racism gave me a kind of freedom, paradoxically, because it said to me, I'll be stupid to waste my time trying to receive recognition from racist white people. So, and it's not that they were problematic Black people, but, you know, I'm usually the only Black person in the class back then, so it had to be white people. And so it struck me that if that's the case, I might as well write what I really want to write, say what I want to say anyway, and learn from the brutality of the responses. Well, it turned out to have been the opposite. 99% of what I've written got published. And I mean that I've sent to get published, got published, because there's a lot I've written I didn't even bother to send places. And things happened from those writings that I began to learn from. I began to learn that your writings have a life of their own, which is another existential thesis. Okay. I began to learn that as others come to the ideas, I can learn from others. In other words, paradoxically, although I developed ideas, I am using the word I now, wrote certain things, the moment they're written, they no longer belong to me. They're part of the world of ideas, the communities. And I'm just like anybody else trying to learn, even though I may have written something, the actual text exceeds me because of the people brought to it. And I learned that writings generate economies because areas of thought develop, journals, academic positions, community centers, all kinds of things. And in that process, I began to see that there's a relationship between all those things and the things that preceded them beyond a causal analysis. In other words, everything done before set conditions of possibilities for other things to be done. And in my case, what I learned from my very first writings was that the problem of bad faith was not simply about the bad faith of the phenomenon I was studying, in that case, anti-Black racism, okay? And for the viewers or listeners, the argument is very straightforward. Racism involves spotting a human being and then denying the humanity of the human being. In a nutshell, it's structurally a lie, because if you're going to claim a human being is not a human being, then you have to explain how you are to identify a human being to deny it in the first place. So racism is a form of bad faith, and then by extension, anti-Black racism is a form of bad faith. But here's the thing. What I discovered upon writing that text was a lot more, because it's not simply about the racist being in bad faith. There's also the question about how we go about studying the phenomenon. In other words, the studier could be in bad faith. And this means that if you're engaged in any intellectual enterprise, the moment you become solipsistic, the moment you close the world off and just fold it onto yourself, you're no longer paying attention to evidence. You're no longer making yourself accountable. So as a matter of what it is to do intellectual work with integrity, you must make yourself accountable. And one of the things struck me is that a lot of Black intellectuals, a lot of Indigenous intellectuals, a lot of women intellectuals, we live in a society where we are often presumed as flawed, which means that our modus operandi, our way of actually having to do our work, is to presume we have to give an account. You see? Whereas there's a form of arrogance in those who presume they don't have to give an account, they don't have to explain their ideas, They presume an internal legitimacy to their ideas. And that is in its structure similar to stuff like white supremacy. It's similar to patriarchy. It's similar to all of the isms in which people treat themselves as if they're gods. So this led me into thinking through three problematics that are linked to existential thought. The first one is, what is it to be a human being? Because you see, the human being, as being able to ask that question of accountability, is always other than the simple mechanisms that try to make us obey the laws of the presumptions of being. The second one is freedom, because colonialism, Euromodernity, etc., try to make us forget that ultimately we have to act to transform the world. But the third, and this is what I had arrived at early on, is that if you can use philosophy, science, ideas for the sake of dehumanization and lying to people about their freedom, for the sake of disempowering people of their ability to act meaningfully, then that leads to a crisis in reason. And I call it the metacritique of reason. The crisis is reason any longer justified? And it goes to an even more radical question. Is even justification justifiable any longer? And that animated a lot of my work. And by the way, it's fine to interrupt me if I'm talking too long. Okay. That was why my second book was called Fanon, The Crisis of European Man. It was subtitled Essay in Philosophy and Human Sciences, because it struck me that there was a form of bad faith in how human sciences were being produced. You see, they were being produced in certain ways that actually snuck in the idea of very specific groups of human beings as the standard for all human beings. But that, in effect, made the rest of humanity not human, supposedly because of not being identical to those who give no account of why they're human. They just assert that they're the standpoint of human. And but it generated a lot of stuff. That's where I discovered the concept of disciplinary decadence, because disciplinary decadence is a kind of bad faith. It's where we treat our disciplines, the studier treats it as if it were created by a god. And if it were created by a god, it's perfect. So just the methods need to be applied. And that leads to methodological fetishism and all kinds of things that are problematic. But I didn't have a response to that problem at that time. I wrote a book called Her Majesties Are the Children, where I addressed the very notion of how can we do social criticism in a neo-colonial age. And then I wrote a book called Existential Africana. I also edited a book called Existence in Black, where I looked at Black existentialism, but a lot of people don't realize that Black existentialism and Africana existentialism are not identical, because Africanness and Blackness are not identical. There are Blacks who are not African, quoting people of Australia, Maori, many examples, Dalits, right? And there are Africans who are not necessarily Black. If you think, for instance, you could think of, say, if you talk to many white South Africans, their identification is of being not being Dutch or being English, is of being African. But if you think about also the people of the north of certain areas who are not white people, but they're not necessarily under the category of Black people. And then even many Black people in Africa were not internal to their own identities historically Black people. There were Oza, Yoruba, Ibu, Luo, Telense, so many ethnic groups, Wolof, but it was colonialism that created them as Black people. And then even beyond those, there's also a naive view that looks at Blackness in a purely negative, Because if colonialism made you Black, then, should you just not be Black? But as we know, the people who became Black were creatively fighting against their dehumanization and brought us all kinds of things to the world, not only from things such as music, foods. A lot of architecture was affected actually by colonialism, not from the Europeans making it, but actually from the Africans and others. We have a lot of sciences that were developed. One of the misreadings of history is to treat enslaved African peoples as brute labor. They were skilled labor. Many of them were physicians. They were agronomists. They were architects. They were soldiers. They were seamstresses, people, tailors. They had lots of things. These are societies that brought their knowledge in fusion with European societies and produced the world we live in. So I decided to write a book called Existential Africana, in which I looked at Africana existential philosophy, because the kind of African diaspora we talk about is part of the Euro-modern world. And I also wrote a book, finally, I wrote a book called Disciplinary Decadence, because by then I realized that the issue with disciplinary decadence is that it ontologizes disciplines, treats them as ontologically complete. But disciplines, when they do that, they cease to communicate with other disciplines. They cease to communicate with reality. So to reintroduce communicating with reality in other disciplines, I developed the idea of a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. And what this means is being willing to go beyond your discipline for the sake of reality. And by the way, this is an insight in psychoanalysis as well, because of course, one of the biggest sources of mental illness is narcissism. And a lot of Euro-modern colonialism is saturated with narcissism. I mean, think about it. It's really narcissistic to come and meet people and say, hi, I'm the superior race. Or if you think about the narcissism of the United States is always saying, the greatest country in history. Really? Says who? I mean, I think the comedian Lewis Black said it well. If there's a dude who keeps showing up to the party and say, you're lucky I'm here. I'm the greatest guy who ever lived. Isn't it great that I'm here? And on and on. Lewis Black said, at some point, the other guests are going to have to kill him. And they probably have to eat him so they could consume his essence. But the point is that a teleological suspension of disciplines is bringing humility to remind you that you're not reality. You're in a relationship with it. And this led to writing other books, but I wrote a book called An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, which brought those three themes: philosophical anthropology, what it is to be human, philosophy of freedom, and positive justification, into the study of African philosophy. And the reason I did that is because one of the things racism does, particularly to Black thinkers and Africana thinkers, is to try to reduce us to our biographies instead of looking at our ideas, And so I decided, what would happen if you look at the ideas and see who talks about them? So with those three problematics, I examined 1,000 years of who talked about those issues. And that's why my book doesn't do what many people expect, which is to look at a bunch of Black thinkers and what they said. Because that's not intellectual. That's just an effort to just look at a racial lacuna. Instead, I looked at what was generated out of this question of the limitations of Euromodernity and how those three questions were there. And my book I ended up talking about women, indigenous peoples. There were people, white, Black, brown, whoever they were, as long as they were addressing those in the context of what it did to the understanding of the African diaspora, they were engaged in Africana philosophy. And so that was that book. And I wrote a book called What Fanon Said, My earlier book wasn't on Fanon. Fanon was a context to deal with those problems I was examining. You see, those existential problematics and other kinds. And but it struck me that Fanon was being accused of a lot of things he never said. And so I thought it would be a good idea to say, well, what did he say? And examine them. And I wrote that book. And I wrote a few other books, some in other languages. But more recently, I did a book called Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. And you could see how some of the themes I'm talking about are linked in that book. And I just finished a book called Fear of Black Consciousness. And that's coming out at the end of the year with a Penguin and Farrell Strauss-Giroux. And you may ask, what is the fear of Black consciousness? The fear of Black consciousness is the fear of reality. In other words, to prop up white supremacy and anti-Black racism, you have to live lies. So it's a fear of truth. At the end of the day, if we're fighting for the liberation of people, if we're fighting against misogyny, if we're fighting against settler colonialism, if we're fighting against anti-Black racism, we're not fighting for lies. Because if what we're fighting for, the liberation and so forth, were lies, then we might as well pack up the day. It means all the stuff that racism and all of that says about us would be true. So once we understand that those things are false, then the effort to keep those falsehoods functioning as truths requires, like the famous story of narcissism in the mirror. What do people do when they don't like what they see in the mirror? They break the mirror. Fear of Black consciousness is the violent effort to break the mirror. And what's reflected back from Black consciousness is not only the infelicities, the injustices, the atrocities of colonialism and racism, but what also is reflected back is that these are problems of political significance because they involve power, which means they need to be resolved politically. And we live in a world right now that's dominated by the moralizing of these issues, the individualizing of these issues in such a way that we cannot get to the political dimensions of them. And so part of fear of Black consciousness is also a fear of the political significance and the political responsibility that's involved in transforming the world for the better. And so if we put that together, you could already see something very unique about Black existentialism and Africana existential thought, because the stereotype of existentialism is a brooding me, I'm dealing with my anger, it's all about me, should I live or die, oh, suicide, to be or not, that stuff. And while those things are important questions, when you're dealing with the historical realities that Black people face, or if you think of what Simone de Beauvoir wrote, with what women have faced historically, you can't have to avoid looking at political reality as an existentialist would be of equivalent of intellectual malpractice. So, in a nutshell, the kind of existential work I do is a socially rich, politically significant kind.
What stands out for me from all of that is how, and probably exactly why I contacted you, why I've started this project in the first place, is how I've just undertaken so many consecutive years of training in psychological thought and philosophical thought, and so much of this is new, so much of this is lacking from the syllabuses. Even it feels almost mortifying that in this day and age this is not just so much more widely taught and shared and encouraged.
Yeah, you're right. And in fact, the way it's taught is horrific in many places, because there's a form of epistemological violence, knowledge violence done. Because if you keep teaching people that only a tiny set of people thought, then what you're really doing is not only misrepresenting history, but you're hammering into certain other people that they lack the capacity to think. It's a fallacy, but they can't help it. If only all the evidence of thinking is just white and predominantly male, what are you supposed to think? If you don't, so give you an example. I teach a course called Global Existentialism. And when I teach that course, I begin with a writing from Antef, okay? And Antef was an ancient East African philosopher, okay? And I put it right in the syllabus. And here's what Antef wrote. This is just an excerpt, okay? Antef wrote, the philosopher, or the lover of wisdom, is he or she whose heart is informed about these things which, about these things which would be otherwise ignored. The one who is clear-sighted when he or she is deep into a problem, the one who is moderate in his or her actions, who penetrates ancient writings, whose advice is sought to unravel complications, who is really wise, who instructed his or her own heart, who stays awake at night as he or she looks for the right paths. Sounds a lot like the conversation we've been having over the past hour. Who's wiser than a sage. I thought that's remarkable. I thought sages are pretty wise. If you're wiser than a sage, my goodness. Who brought himself or herself to wisdom, who asked for advice and sees to it that he or she is asked for advice. And that is from approximately 1900 BCE, okay? Now, my student, we discussed that in my first class, but of course, what my students leave with is if somebody walks up to them and said, philosophy was created in ancient Greece 2,500 years ago, my students would say, I just read something from 4,000 years ago. And it doesn't mean earlier means better, but at least means it existed. And this fellow talks about ancient writings. So, a lot of people, they don't even think of Africans with writing, but ancient Africans wrote. But also sometimes I talk about the writings of Hepshet. She was a physician, a philosopher, etc. And in that course, we read people like Zara Yacob, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher, and what he has to say about reason and faith and thought. We read Kierkegaard. We read Simone Weil. Simone Weil is extraordinary with her work on decreation. She argues, like the Hindu people in Zen Buddhism, that one of the greatest sources of evil is the ego. If we're so full of our ego, there's no room for others. So that's almost identical to my argument about the teleological suspension of disciplinarity. If we egotize our disciplines, there's no room for others. We can't communicate with others and learn. We read writings of Ali Shariati, the Persian/Iranian sociologist and existential philosopher who knew Fanon and translated into Persian Le Damné de la Terre, the damned of the earth. We read Sartre, we read Beauvoir, as I mentioned. We read Surya Aurobindo. Surya Aurobindo is extraordinary, from India. And sometimes Tagore as well, but Surya Aurobindo, my goodness, the things he and Shariati have to say on free thinking, on creativity, on our relationship to science, all the things I've been talking about right now. There, we read a Cameroonian literary theorist and philosopher, Natalie. She wrote a text called Melancholia Africana. We read Kaiji Nishitani, Religion and Nothingness, where Nishitani just gets to the point. He says the problem with ontology is it covers reality. And people in the Western tradition would say, what are you talking about? But his whole point when we talk about existence, right, means we also have to go into dealing with reality as not simply at the level of being, but also at negation. And also, and draw upon the resources, whether it's shunyata, the notion of radical emptiness, whether it's the concept of dharma, different concepts there. We look at my Existential Africana book, and there are times we look at varieties of people like Steve Biko, A lot of people don't realize Biko was a political existential writer. He's one of the architects of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. But the main thing is my students get a richer understanding, and that these are not uniquely Western questions. Humanity asks these questions, and that's why I call it global existentialism. And I even encourage them also to understand it's not just about texts. It's also about being creative on the resources. There's existential thought in music. The blues, for instance, is very existential. Boy, Led Zeppelin is very existential. There's a rock and roll, some of that Jimmy Page stuff, sambas, reggae, all of those films, yeah.
So how can music and film be existential?
Well, think of a good example. Think of jazz as an example. Jazz musicians meet, they don't have to know what the song is, and they could play music. In addition to that, even if they know the song they're playing, they don't know how that song is going to be played till they perform it. One of the existential theses is you don't know the outcome before the performance. And what's even striking about jazz is, and not just jazz, because there are many improvisational music, people do it in rock and roll and other things, but the reason they're able to play and they're able to do something extraordinary, which is when each person takes a moment to perform the lead, the others, they don't simply step back and have that person perform. They also do things to push that person to perform better. You see, it's not the selfish, egotistic, it's all about me. If I'm not the star, then nobody. No, when you have a responsibility as a jazz musician to have every member, the piano player, the saxophone player, the drummer, the bass, do her or his best performance. But here's the thing, you could only do it if while you're playing, you're listening to the other. Listening is such an important element of existential ethics. This question of voice, what's the point if you're making sounds if nobody's listening? If we think about what I said about political reality, political life depends on speech. But as we know, racism, sexism, and varieties of misanthropic actions ignore certain people when they speak, rendering them ineffable or invisible, and as a consequence, without political efficacy. So jazz, could you imagine if many societies were like a jazz performance? If democracies were like, you get people into society and everybody's trying their best to make sure everybody else perform their best. Wow. And to understand that not everybody does the same thing, right? Not everybody does the same thing, but it's like, wow, if we could help you do your thing, great. Wow, what a society we could live in. So the existential dimensions of jazz, and also there are a lot of jazz musicians. I mean, like Charles Mingus is profoundly existential because even at the level of tonality, I'm a musician, so there's certain technical things about music I know, but to put it in a nutshell, what's called the blue notes, the fact that you could use dissonance. There are people who want to sugarcoat reality. It's almost like playing in major chords all the time. Da, 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 da. But, being happy all the time could be quite miserable. Paradoxically, I remember I went to my kids at Disney World. I had to get the hell out of there by day 3. It was just too damn happy. Even the wallpaper is happy. That's no. Sometimes it's not that the work you're being bad in being sad, but there are forms of sadness that are connected to being in tune with reality. But similarly, there are forms of jokes, humor. You laugh because you can understand it. But there are times you're supposed to be angry because you can understand it. So the music brings dissonance There are times in jazz you could have sad sounds. Right? If you listen to Charles Mingus' Meditations on Integration, he deals with the ambivalence, but also at the level of rhythms, right? I'm going to tap something, right? So I just tapped, I did 2 bars of 4. But as you know, that could be done with a like circular type pattern. Or you, and here's the thing that's interesting. In jazz, you learn you could just make it roll in any meter. So I could tap again. That's meaningless at the moment until I tell you I did 2 bars of 7. But if I said 2 bars of 7, I could do it this way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. I could do it this way. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, even though my tapping is the exact same way, you notice the number combinations made it sound different. And this is one of the insights. It reminds us that although there is something objective like the meter, what makes it groove is what we bring to it. Humanity is a project of grooving. We have to bring beauty, joy, creativity to existence. And so the same 7 could be done this way. This is 7 too. That's also 7. And but you heard the difference. So yeah, jazz, and it's no accident. And there's one more thing I have to say about jazz as an example. It's not only jazz, but I'm just using jazz here. Jazz is fundamentally a music about freedom. And it's a music about freedom with faith in the other human being's ability to perform and to exemplify beauty in her or his freedom.
Even the way that you speak about the music and how jazz is freedom, and how jazz relies on a or enables a collection of kind of people that are faced with uncertainty. How will that piece come together? We have absolutely no exact idea. It's so representative of how humans can be together, how humans can, if they have that faith, if they're willing to sit with that uncertainty and that creativity, and be there, like you're saying, supporting each other.
Absolutely. And in fact, there's something that many of us overlook. And we're living in times where this is of extraordinary consequence. You see, I already said our planet is small. You know, once you go from a few thousand Homo sapiens to 8 billion, and you have technologies to reach each other in a nanosecond, and you could, I mean, today we're in a world where if we have to fly to another part of the planet and it takes more than 24 hours, we're pissed. You know, it used to take 3 years just to get to another side. Well, in the midst of all that, one of the things that we face is that we're in a conflict. One conflict is trying to make everything stop. That conflict that side wants being. And they tend to speak in language like rule, order. It's the right wing, you know. They want to have predictability. They want to know the outcome before the performance. But that's just not how people live. It's part of how we live. We do make planning. I'm in a house. A house represents a place I could come back to. You know, there are books there. There are things I could consult. But when you and I sat down to speak, we know the topic, but we didn't know what we were going to say. And I intentionally did not plan my answers. You did send me some questions ahead, but I intentionally did not. And the reason is because when you and I sit down to meet, it's you and I. And how I would speak with you, although they're concepts I know, how I will speak with you this moment is like the jazz performance. It's uniquely ours that we'll share with the viewers. But that means I have to have faith and respect for your abilities of what you have to ask or say. And you already, by virtue of asking me, in a way made a testament to that, to you having some faith in some things I have to say. Well, this other side now, not the right wing, close, order, governing side, but the other side, is based on change, possibility. Sometimes when we're speaking, we discover things we didn't think about before, even though we're the ones speaking. Yeah. And society is in that way. You see, it's not that one shoe size fits all. We're constantly building, creating different things. It may be, in some cases, shoes aren't appropriate. And so when we are building and developing those relationships like the jazz performance, democracy is very jazz-like. Because it means when others contribute, new relationships are developed, and they may not have been what you planned. Not only that, if they're politically significant, they're going to reach beyond you or me, which means that political responsibility also pertains to the anonymous. And it also means that there are always those who are not here. There are those who are not here because they've passed on, the dead. We call them ancestors. Yet we can have responsibility for them. And then there are those who are to come, we call descendants. But those who are to come are not necessarily about our biological descendants. A lot of these books are ancestors. I'm not biologically connected to some of the people here, and some I am, because like the woman who designed the cover of this book was my daughter. So, is my daughter rather. So, Sula is her name. And there are things that we could, but eventually, as we know, Plato had no reason to know there would be a Lewis Gordon, or Natalie Atoke. And Antef had no reason to think that his letter was going to be read in a classroom of, 300 to 500 students, you know what I mean? Trying to think things through. So, and similarly, whether we like it or not, we're the conditions for what will come. And we can make the conditions be such that there's a planet with oxygen still on it. It could be the conditions of other life forms being able to live rather than continual paths of extinction. And there is just so much that we can do. So in the end, I think this point about jazz, I actually see a lot of democracy as jazz-like, you see? And there are all of these other elements, that we could see about the interconnectedness of things. I mean, it's interesting. Look at your name, Natalie, right? Yeah, your name related to natal, that which gives birth. Okay. I didn't know I would even say that, but in this context, it is of interesting relevance. And the work you're doing in psychology, some of the funny things that happen in existential thought is, and it happens in psychoanalysis. Our parents name us, and sometimes they have no clue about what our name means. But it's weird, isn't it? That a lot of people somehow, maybe at a subconscious level, fulfill their names. You see? So for instance, you're giving birth to this series, to ideas, learning, all kinds of things. My name, Lewis. My full name is Louis Ricardo Gordon. Well, Lewis from Ludwig, from Luther. Some people translate as warrior from Latin. Luda also means victorious in athletic stuff, but Ludwig also means the defender of the fort or the victorious leader, right? So, right? So, but Ricardo is very interesting because it's from Rex. And when people hear Rex, they think of king. So they think warrior king. But the part that's interesting is Rex is the Latinization of an ancient African word. And it was Rix from Meduneter. Rix is connected to the word Reket. The Reket were ancient female scientists because the earliest scientists were female for lots of reasons that anthropologists and archaeologists will explain. It's a good idea for ancient women to pay attention to cycles, to see calibrate the stars, everything from womb, how food grows. And so the Reket in ancient Kemet, which today you know is Egypt, were predominantly female communities of scientists. And of course, they meant they had to study rules, like laws. So regulation. But Romans were patriarchal societies. And so for them, the emperor, the regulator, the rex, had to be male, but it's actually a female-oriented name, right? And so it brings together the idea of a person who fights with the conjunction of female and male spirits in leadership capacities for communities. So I'm sure that's not what my mother and father were thinking when they named me. But it's a lot like the story of Kafka's Gate, right? It goes full circle. It turns out that perhaps what is in a subconscious level that motivates action is in our names. And which means I'm sorry for some people who have some very nefarious names. I mean, gee, John Madoff made off with people's money. You know what I mean? But anyway, the point I was leading up to there is basically this understanding that the political responsibility of which I speak is that the real issue with political action, I argue in my writings, is not about whether you know the outcomes. It's about asking, what are your commitments? Because if it's about your commitments, and if you think historically, the enslaved people who preceded me, the many women who fought for a different way of understanding women in society, are the people who set the conditions that enable a woman like you to be speaking to a man like me right now. And they had no way of predicting it. They were just committed to building a different kind of world. And I think we face a similar thing. Those future people may not know us, but they could only emerge through our actions. And if we act well, what they'll think back to us is those proverbial words. Thank you.
I'm wondering for people who have listening to this and they're not maybe able to get hold of all these books or at least absorb them all at the same time. How would you recommend for people who are interested in exploring the field of existential thinking to get involved with it?
Oh, there's so many ways. Right now, everybody goes to the internet. If they're interested in what I do, I try to I have a lot of my writings available for free, and I post syllabi and courses. But they should start by also trying to read novels or literature that really move them and ask themselves the questions about whom it would lead them to. The novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a profound existential novel. You know, they could look at films. A lot of people don't realize how much existentialism is in film. And I consider the Marcel Camus Black Orpheus to be a great example. Lena Wertmüller's Swept Away, Ulzim Paul's Sugarcane Alley. In the UK, Steve McQueen's Small Axe, you know, that series that just came out. I mean, it's profoundly existential in just so many ways, you know. I mean, the list is just long, particularly in films. But if we think about novels and plays, I already mentioned Pablo Neruda's, right, poetry, the writings of Beckett, Jamaican Kincaid novels. There's a Dalit poet, Chandramohan S. His work is great. And of course, you know, there what you call you know, there are people like Lorraine Hansberry, right? Her plays and her essays. And of course, there are people like Albert Camus, you know, the plague right now people are thinking about in terms of the pandemic. But you know, his novel, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre's writings, novels, Simone de Beauvoir's. There are just so many. There's Lu Xun in China, The Real Story of AQ, and other stories of China, Frederick Douglass's narratives. There are just so many. And what I recommend in the beginning is to ask yourself first a question. Ask yourself, when you're as honest with yourself as possible, what really matters to you? And if you ask that question, then you go to the next question. Why? Why is it so important? And then once you ask that, look at people who are, don't look at people who are labeled existentialists. Look at people who address those questions in their writings and follow your way. Now, if you of course want to have something that's very short, if you're a student and you want something very scholarly, the Edinburgh Encyclopedia of Continental Philosophy has a section that I edited on existential philosophy that's very succinct, very much to the point. And there are also wonderful internet resources, such as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, though that's more like philosophers showing off to philosophers, you know. But I do find that there are very easy, not easy in the sense that simple-minded, but easy in the sense of clearly written, because ideas should challenge us as well. Texts that are out there that could be very useful. And those are some of the places that I recommend. Gail Weiss, for instance, did a wonderful recent text for Northwestern University Press on key concepts in phenomenology, but they talk about existential concepts as well. And also a lot of Black novelists were existentialists. Richard Wright, his novels are all existential novels. James Baldwin. You could find Neil Larson, quite a few where you can have that impact. But boy, and my goodness, if you go and read the short stories of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, particularly the story of poor Arendera and her heartless grandmother, is epic. And there's just a whole lot. There's a whole lot. And even horror. By the way, there are a lot of great horror and fantasy films. I think a profoundly existential horror film was the original version of Let the Right One In. I teach a course on horror and literature. And many of them raise I mean, if you could stomach it, you know, very important, disturbing questions. If we look at some of the recent things that are happening right now in terms of cinema and stories about race and challenges of how people are to live together, many of those are there. And of course, some of the classic great films like The Seventh Seal, you know what I mean? Where there's a whole struggle with death, or even television series. There's a lot of existentialism in Doctor Who. And the Twilight Zone series, Rick and Morty is very existential. And of course, that great series, I think the second season of Fleabag is profoundly existential. And what ties them all together is they're all explorations of human beings struggling with the question of responsibility for our existence. And they all are truthful about the fact that we don't always get it right.
And speaking about responsibility, I think the biggest takeaway that I'm having from this dialogue that we've had is the responsibility of the people involved with the institutions as well, with the messages that they're sharing and what they're propagating. And I feel, you spoke earlier about we neither of us knew what this was going to bring for each other, and I know what this has done is it's just really reiterated to me how compelled I am to kind of push a, a much more diverse understanding of ideas and philosophies within different communities that I can be involved with. And I think to also pick up on that point that you made of we're not always going to see the change. And I think that can put people off trying to make a change, not having that, especially raised in this society, like you were saying, that everything is so instant now. We almost feel that if we're not making a change and seeing that change immediately, then what's the point of even trying? It's not about that. Maybe it's about staying connected with what we're passionate about and following that and seeing where it leads. And maybe we'll never see the extent of what it leads, but that's important too.
Absolutely. Your what you just said was, as we say, beautifully stated.
I find it very distracting, this interview, because it stirs up uh so much anger in a way, I think. And I know that anger is an emotion that I struggle with giving space to, but we've spanned history in this beautiful time travel throughout this interview, and part of me feels so, we've done so well. And you, as you pointed out, there's me talking to you and we're miles apart and we're instantly communicating. In some ways through time we've come so far as humans, but in other ways it's almost embarrassing where we are now, how divided we are still now, how the discourse it exists as it is, how the institutions exist as it is. So I don't really know how to sit with that, but something for me to process definitely after this interview.
Well, what you just talked about is what Jade Gordon and I call the pedagogical imperative. The pedagogical imperative is the imperative to keep learning. You know, I once had a debate with a conservative who was against Black studies, and he said, there shouldn't be Black studies because it makes people angry. And I first said, what's wrong with that? I mean, but fleshed out, it's not that they're angry in the sense that they're closed off from others. They're angry because they want to learn. When you go and take philosophy classes, and there's all this world of philosophy out there, and there are people who are not themselves taking time to learn it, you begin to wonder, are they in love at all with learning? I mean, I took the time to learn it. I mean, there are things that it just meant I had to work at it. And when we go to study, we go for an education. And in a case, and I always say to my students, I always begin class with a conversation what a professor and a student are, and also on what education is. And my students always think professors are like Moses with the tablets. And I have to explain to them that's not how I see a professor. I see a professor as someone who fell in love with learning and just continued learning. And so I'm just an advanced student, and they're beginning students. But here's the thing, we don't have the same experiences. A beginning student may bring something to a subject that I've not seen before, which means I can learn from a beginning student. And the beginning student already presumes that she or he can learn from me because I'm the professor, but they think differently if they realize that I'm an advanced student. It means that every time I teach a class, I'm in a process of co-learning. And I have something to offer, but they think of themselves differently when they realize they have something to offer. So in a way, the anger of which you speak is a healthy one, because it's an understanding that this is much larger than you may have initially thought. And the thing, when we begin to see this, is that we do love learning. And once we begin to understand that, we begin to see that ongoing communicative practices will bring more to the table, but also it will produce different kinds of human beings. We need to get rid of the arrogance that we're the end of the story. We're just a stage in a story. And, it's funny, I'm right now in conversations with people who are doing work in deep space. There will be hominins that are very different from us. And we need to get our stuff together, because if we don't understand how to treat each other with our differences, that future won't look good. So, yeah. The thing right now is to understand the power of communication, power in the good sense. Because you see, the problems of which I spoke were from commitments of disempowerment. But we need also to develop commitments of empowerment. Commitments of empowerment are commitments that enable people to grow.
I'm aware of the time, and I think that's a really, really beautiful place to end it. But of course, wanted to offer, is there anything else that you wanted to add to this interview?
Actually, I prefer for you to add to this interview, if there's a reflection you have that we could close with.
Indeed, I think if people watch this and even spend one moment having a conversation with someone who hasn't watched it, or even someone that has, or encourage them to watch it, and just to continue this discourse, I hope that will have an impact. And little by little, I think of the world, we have ripples, and we never know where our ripple might lead, but hopefully that this can lead to some dialogues, and just an increasing dialogue around these areas of thought. We've spoken a lot of the power of word in book form, and you've given this beautiful repertoire of your own work and other people's work, but also the power of the word by spoken word, the communications just by language. And there can be so much power in these passing conversations that we have with other people about the topics that we're passionate about. If we have, like the beautiful story you shared about your mother, if we have the courage that stems from a love and from a passion, we never know where that might lead.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked you that.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your time today, and for, of course, all the time that is going to be taken up in my head processing this, no doubt for years to come. And I can't wait to share this myself with my friends and my colleagues. But thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you.